Sanbonani Dumelang, good evening and welcome to episode 203 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Kumalo. It's a Thursday edition of the Private Property Podcast, and if you're joining us for the first time, well, you have missed out on some great episodes. So do make sure that you go to our Facebook or our YouTube page to catch up on some of the great content that we have brought to your screens. And to all our regular viewers, welcome back. You know how we do it. Always tackling a hot property topic and really learning how to best navigate our property journey. Remember to stay in touch with us across our social media platforms, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or on Twitter. And you can also follow myself at Zamantungwa_K on Instagram as well as on Twitter. Now, of course, one of the other great things that we absolutely love doing here on Private Property is running great competitions where you at home stand a chance of walking away with great prizes. And we kickstarted 2021 with the Sherlock Holmes competition, where we want you to solve the riddle and let us know where the riddle takes you. And all you have to do is to go to www.privateproperty.co.za and crack the riddle of the week. So every single Monday, we share the new riddle, and we want you to basically participate in our Sherlock Holmes hunt in order to crack that riddle. Now, the riddle for week 5 is one that seems quite easy for people that I think lived in Centurion. I saw some of people saying they already cracked it within hours of us posting it live. So if you've lived in Centurion, perhaps you might have an idea of where this riddle is pointing you to. And of course, do make sure that you go onto our website to let us know where it's taking you. And that riddle for week 5 is: east of where the Centurion stands, you'll find a house of English beauty, space for your Aston, the Bentley, and the Jag, and four beds up the Cornwall Hill. And that is week 5's riddle for the Sherlock Holmes hunt. Now, in the event that you do crack that riddle, well, you stand a chance of walking away with 5,000 Rand voucher every single Friday. But to keep things interesting, we also give away 500 Rand in cash every Wednesday and Thursday, and that is for our spot prize. And all you have to do to claim that 500 Rand cash prize is to be watching us live, so that should we call your name, you're able to message us down here below and claim that prize. It's absolutely that easy to walk away with loads of prizes here on Private Property. Now, one of the other things I absolutely love talking about, and because it's a Thursday, you're also going to get a sneak peek of this are the other great shows that we bring to your screens. Now, I am talking about the Farming Podcast by Umbali Nwoko that comes to your screens every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. And you can look forward to that just after this podcast this evening, where Umbali Nwoko will take you through all things agriculture. And every Wednesday at 8 p.m., Essie Clarkson brings you the First Time Home Buyers Show. Over the weekend, Chad doesn't leave you alone. He brings you the Home Shoppers Show, where he gives you a sneak peek of some of the best estates and complexes that this country has on offer. Well, we certainly do have quite a lot on offer for you here on Private Property to make sure that you have a really great property journey, whether you're buying, whether you're renting, whether you're selling. It really doesn't matter where you are in your home ownership journey. We certainly are here to cater to you. Now, and that actually brings us to what we're talking about this evening. And I was saying to my guest of air that I would never want to find myself in a situation like this. And I really do hope that I don't find myself in a situation like this. But he'll explain to us what would happen in the event where we do what we can or cannot do. And he was even saying, you know what, it's actually not as admin intensive as you probably think. These things sometimes happen and there are ways to resolve it. And of course, we're looking at steps to take if a party to a transaction passes away when you are buying a property. And we really will be looking at, what happens when a seller passes away, as well as what a buyer passes away when you are in the process of buying a property. And to help us better understand what these steps are, I'm joined this evening by Marius van Rensburg, who is a partner at Schindlers Attorneys. Marius, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Marius, I was saying to you off air, I would never want to find myself in this kind of situation. I've unfortunately been in a situation where a seller, fell ill in the middle of a transaction, and we weren't able to reach them for a couple of days. Luckily, they were not, too critical at all. They were able to, leave hospital in a couple of days, and were able to pick up essentially where we left off. But unfortunately, the reality of, the world and life is that sometimes people do pass away in the middle of a transaction. Perhaps let's first deal with what happens when a seller passes away. Later on, we'll look at what would happen in the event where a buyer passes away and what steps to actively take. But in the event where a seller passes away, Marius, what would then be the steps of that particular transaction?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's unfortunate, and I must tell you, I've been doing conveyancing for nearly 25 years, and it's not something that happens on a regular basis, thank goodness. But when it happens, it's sad, it's unfortunate, but it does create some problems. So first of all, when a seller falls away, the first thing to understand is that the agreement of sale that was entered into during the course of that seller's lifetime does not fall away. That sale agreement remains valid and binding on the parties, and what really happens is that we stop the transaction. And I was joking with you off air that we've sometimes had matters where the matter's in the deeds office and the seller passes away, and they call us to tell us the seller passed away. I was half joking, half serious when I said, I wish the people didn't phone us, because if they phone us, the reality is that the power of attorney that the seller signed becomes invalid. So you remember that the rule around a power of attorney is that the power of attorney is only valid for so long as the person who's granting it has the power to revoke it. And once they pass away, that power of attorney becomes invalid, it's unenforceable. So I could be in the deeds office, I could be anywhere in the process, I could be on prep in the deeds office. If I find out as a conveyancer that the seller has passed away, I must withdraw the matter from the deeds office. I must stop the process. And really what I need to do is I need to work with the family to appoint an executor. So remember, in terms of the Administration of Deceased Estates Act, until an executor is appointed, there's nobody who can represent that deceased estate. And that's really, really important. Sometimes what we find that a father passes away, the children or the surviving spouse are appointed as executor in terms of the will. They are what I call an executor in waiting. They're not vested with any power at all. It's only once you've reported the estate to the Master of the High Court, and the Master of the High Court has issued you with letters of executorship in terms of the Administration of Deceased Estates Act, that you actually have authority to act on behalf of that estate. And that's really what we need to do. We need to gather the documentation. So in other words, when someone dies, you need to report the estate, have the executor appointed. And that's not a massively complicated process. You need the death notice, you need a couple of other bits and pieces of documentation. And what you do is you submit those documents to the Master of the High Court. The Master of the High Court issues letters of executorship. And some organizations, when they do this, what they do is they put the documentation together and they hand deliver it to the Master of the High Court, and it takes weeks and weeks and weeks for the executor to be appointed. If you use a consultant, and I'm not talking about bribery and corruption at all, if you use a legitimate consultant, you can get those letters of executorship within a few days after reporting. So in other words, you gather the documentation together, you deliver it to the master, you get the letters of executorship. From a procedural point of view, the executor must now re-sign the power of attorney. So, for example, it would be Marius van Rensburg in his capacity as executor in the deceased estate of the late Joe Bloggs. Okay, and I would then sign the power of attorney as executor. And then remember that there's a process with the Master of the High Court. There's an endorsement on that power of attorney. It's called a Section 42.2 endorsement. So when someone passes away, I need a 42.2 endorsement from the Master of the High Court. And again, this can be a longer or short process, but you have your documents together, you submit to the Master. The Master endorses the power of attorney, all right? Once that's done, I can then re-lodge in the deeds office. And I hope I've made that sound simple. It's not always as simple as that, because there's documentation to put together, there's family, there's emotion. And And you know, generally speaking, it's a desirable thing because for the transfer to go through. An executor does have the authority to decide to continue the transaction or not continue the transaction. If they decide not to continue the transaction, well, then essentially the estate is in breach, and the consequences of the breach must follow. But generally speaking, from what I've seen over practice is that the liquidation of the assets of the deceased is a desirable thing. If the deceased was going to sell the property, we want to continue with that transaction. So, in summary, you appoint the executor, re-sign your documentation, get the endorsement from the Master and High Court, and then you relodge in the deeds office. There is one small difference on the endorsement that I might mention. If a person dies, an executor is appointed, and the executor sells the property. Okay, when I get my endorsement from the Master of the High Court, I need all major heirs in the estate to consent because it impacts them. It's different if the seller sold the property or the deceased sold the property during the course of their lifetime. I still need the 42.2 endorsement, but I don't need the consent of the heirs because it was during the course of the lifetime of the seller. I get my power of attorney. Obviously, at that stage, I'll probably get updated rates, clearances, etc. But I can relodge in the deeds office and I can finalize my transaction. And then what I do is I pay the proceeds of sale into the deceased estate later account opened by the executor as opposed to paying it to the deceased. And those same rules apply if it's a husband and wife, and for argument's sake, one of those spouses dies. Same thing. I can't continue. I'm going to stop the bus, report the estate, letters the executor, and then I can continue.
Mm-hmm. And Marius, I think one of the things that I definitely wanted to explore, and because you're saying that by virtue of a seller passing away doesn't necessarily mean that the transaction doesn't go through, and you outline so well, what would essentially subsequently happen afterwards. But I certainly do want to, get a sense of what would happen in the event where, suppose, for example, it is whether it's a parent who passes away and the children then no longer want the sale to go ahead. They almost want first everything to pause, maybe for them to catch their breath, and then at a later stage perhaps decide if they do want to sell or not sell. I certainly do want to have a sense of that. We are, of course, taking your questions and comments this evening. We're looking at steps to take when one party passes away during a sale of a property. And I certainly do want to hear from you at home if you've ever encountered something like this or it has happened to you during your home ownership journey. See, we've got a comment here coming from Uglad Shirinda on Facebook saying, it happened to me, a buyer passed away and the transaction was already at the deeds office in the data prep stage, and the conveyancer advises to cancel the deal. And of course, right now we're dealing with what happens when the seller passes away. We'll deal with what happens when a buyer passes away shortly. But before we get to that one, Marius, what then happens in the event where the loved ones of the seller say they don't want the sale to currently go forward, whether they're still processing or perhaps for them it's just emotions, as you were saying. What would then happen in the event where they say we're stopping the sale, we don't want our mother's or our father's property to be sold at this stage?
Well, the terms and conditions of the sale agreement that the seller entered into during the course of the seller's lifetime are binding on the estate. So whatever that agreement says, the executor who's appointed must make a decision. I'm going to abide by the contract. I'm not going to abide by the contract. I no longer want to sell the property, for example, at the request, during as a result of the wishes of the deceased family. And I mean, in 20 plus years, I've actually never come across it, to be honest. But the scenario would be that the executor in the estate could, for example, go to the buyers and try and negotiate a cancellation under the circumstances. And if that negotiation was agreed to, you would need to deal with the estate agents commission. The estate will pay the estate agents commission. And if the buyer agreed, well, then we can enter into an agreement of cancellation and cancel the transaction. If the buyers don't agree, then the buyers need to enforce their rights. As I was saying to you off there, I have a couple of instances where sellers at the moment want to cancel agreements due to COVID because they can't fulfill their plans. It's exactly the same situation, whether the seller's still alive or the seller's represented by an executor now after passing on. You have a set of contractual rights and obligations between both parties, and if the seller refuses to continue, well, the buyer, of course, then must try and enforce that sale agreement. And if necessary, the buyer must bring an application to court for an order to enforce the agreement. And there's a reality with this kind of scenario, and that reality is that you're dealing with residential property, and it's expensive to go to court. So sometimes sellers take the view that says, you know what, I'm cancelling. Give it your best shot. I'm prepared to pay the agent's commission. I'm walking away. Let's see. I'm throwing down the gauntlet. Are you going to take up the challenge and go to court or not? And very often you find buyers, particularly in residential transactions, will say, you know what, I'm not prepared to spend 30, 40, 50,000 rand going to court to enforce this agreement. I'll just go and buy another property. It's too much admin and hassle for me. Of course, on the other hand, I have seen over the years buyers who go, no, I'm not accepting that. I've arranged my life. I've done X, Y, and Z. This is the property I want. I want it. And you either give it to me or I'm going to go to court to enforce my rights. And they do go to court and they enforce their rights. But that's kind of a decision where you're weighing the pros and cons and the expenses and the risks and how you want to proceed.
And I mean, I can imagine you certainly do not want to find yourself in a situation where you have to go to court, to compel the seller to go ahead with that sale agreement, because so many things could happen in between, whether seller decides that if they see that you actually are quite determined, whether they decide that they'll maybe damage the property slightly so that by the time you kind of get it, there's quite a lot of work waiting for you to fix. So I can already imagine that that's something that you probably do not want to deal with. Now, Marius, we've been exploring, the one end of what would happen during a sale agreement. That is, of course, in the event where a seller passes away. But as Glad, pointed out, they've been in a situation where the buyer passes away. So here you are, you're a seller, and you've been working with your agent, and you finally get somebody who, offers the right price point for your property, and you've signed the OTP, and it's now at relatively advanced sort of stages. The bond has been granted, and perhaps the matter is now just sitting at the deeds office in order to be registered. What then happens? What are the steps in the event where the buyer passes away during a transaction?
When a buyer passes away, it's a case of legalities versus practicalities. And that's a simple reality of where we are. So for example, when the buyer passes away, it's the same procedure. The sale agreement is binding on the buyer's estate. There's corresponding rights and obligations, and the agreement doesn't fall away because the buyer has passed away. The agreement continues to exist in its same format. The buyer's family must appoint an executor. The executor must step into the shoes of the deceased and decide what to do. So now we come up across with what I talk about practicalities. If the transaction is a bond transaction, and this is something that people don't like to hear, but the bank is going to withdraw the bond. And the bank's going to withdraw the bond, if I can state this plainly, because people who aren't alive can't repay bonds. They have no income. So it's as simple as that, right? So when someone passes away, the bank says, I'm very sorry to hear that, and they withdraw the bond. Now there's no financing, but you must understand that the consequence of withdrawing a bond is not that the agreement is unsuspensive again. The agreement remains in place. It's the same as we have buyers sometimes, right? And they don't want to go into their transaction. So you know what they do? They run to the bank and they say, withdraw the bond, because they think that once we've withdrawn the bond, the deal is no longer binding, but it's not. All that the withdrawal of the bank's finance does is it leaves the buyer without finance. There's still the suspensive condition relating to loan finance is an opportunity to get finance. Once you have finance, your agreement's binding. If the bank withdraws the bond, you're bound by the same terms and obligations, you just don't have money to pay. And that really happens with a deceased person. So on a very practical level, if there's a bond transaction, the deal falls away. That's generally what happens. And in my experience, there's a lot of sympathy amongst the parties and the estate agents, and the parties agree to cancel the transaction and just walk away. In theory, the seller has the right to bring an application to court to enforce the agreement. But remember, court's not going to grant you an order to enforce an agreement which is impossible to enforce.
Yeah.
And of course, you can get complicated there. Maybe the deceased estate has actually got money to buy the property. They don't need the bond, or then maybe you can. In all my years of practice, I'll be honest with you, I've absolutely never seen it happen, not even once. And differentiate that from a scenario where the buyer passes away, but the purchase price is fully secured. So the purchase price is in my trust account. It's all there. It's done. So now what happens is the same thing. The buyer's family appoints an executor. The executor represents the estate. But now the seller is less inclined to let go because the seller sold the property. They sold the property because they don't want to own the property anymore. They have a deal. The purchase price is secured. Why would they let go of the sale? So in those instances, and I have an example like this right now, where we're going to wait for the executor to be appointed. The executor must make an election. Yes, I'm going to proceed. No, I'm not going to proceed. If the executor says I'm going to proceed, well, that's fine. Now I transfer the property into the name of the estate late. I transfer it to the property in the estate of the late Marius from Rensburg. And I transfer the property. Now the executor can deal with the property in terms of the will of the deceased, either sell the property out or transfer the property to heirs, whichever works best. And of course, if the buyer doesn't want to proceed, well, best case scenario, the seller and the executor get together and they find a negotiated settlement to cancel the transaction. Again, bearing in mind that there's an obligation to pay the estate agent the commission. Alternatively, they go into dispute situation and the seller has the right to enforce the agreement. Of course, when it's a cash deal and the money is in the trust account, it's easier for the seller to enforce the agreement and to get a court order that's possible of being carried out. So, they can get the order and they can actually transfer the property. But I must say, I've never seen it happen where the parties really fight about it. They always find a solution to these problems.
We are taking your questions and comments this evening as we talk about what happens in the event where one party passes away during a sale of a property. We've got a question coming through from Facebook. Natalie Leroux asking, is there not a cooling off period in a case where the deal started and someone passes away? And Marius, as you answer that one, because I already know the answer just based on what we've been talking about, perhaps first explain the cooling off period, because this is actually one of those terms that a lot of people tend to wonder about when it comes to property. You've signed that OTP and you sometimes think, well, maybe I can just change my mind. Perhaps first actually explain the cooling off period before we apply it to whether it's applicable in the context of somebody passing away.
There's actually two cooling off rights, okay, and the one arises from the Consumer Protection Act and the other one arises from the Alienation of Land Act, and they're completely different. The Alienation of Land Act cooling off right is if a buyer buys a property and the property is valued less than 250,000 Rand. It cannot have been bought on auction. It can't be vacant land, and the buyer must be a natural person, not a PTY, CC or trust. Okay, the buyer has 5 days within which to notify the seller that they're not going to continue with the transaction, and that's the 5-day cooling off right. But it's only under those limited circumstances. It must be in 5 days, and you must notify your seller in writing. So no, you don't have to have a rhyme or reason. You simply write a letter and say, I'm not going to proceed with the transaction. And the thinking around that legislation is that people who are buying for 250,000 or less are not sophisticated. They have to have the right to withdraw from a decision that they made. I personally think that the legislature should have increased that 250 a long time ago, but kind of that's where it is. And it's obligatory when you sell a property for 250 and less to have that clause in your agreement advising those that buyer of that right. And in fact, many years ago, I represented an agent at the Estate Affairs Board, for the ethical transgression on not putting that in their agreement.
Mm-hmm.
The second kind of cooling off right arises from the Consumer Protection Act in Section 16, read with Section 32. And what this cooling off right says is that, and again, it's very, very limited. First of all, the sale must have been in the ordinary course of the business of the supplier being the seller. And second of all, the transaction must have resulted from direct marketing. If those two criteria are there, again, the buyer has a period, if I recall correctly, of 5 days of cooling off from the transaction. Here's the reality. If I buy a residential property from another residential owner, that transaction doesn't fall within the provisions of the Consumer Protection Act because the sale's not in the ordinary course of the business. If I buy from a developer, a sectional title scheme, it's in the ordinary course of the business, right? So now I fulfill that one criteria. The second criteria is, did the transaction result from direct marketing? So in other words, if I saw a billboard when I drove it down the road, that's indirect marketing, and I bought the property, the right doesn't apply. So the application of the Consumer Protection Act cooling off right is also actually, in truth, very, very limited.
And I suppose one would also just argue that under which circumstances would it have been direct marketing? Because rarely do developers, for example, call you directly to say, we're building this new development, in this place, are you interested? We'll bring in the papers. It really actually happens like that. We typically would see that billboard, or you would go into privateproperty.co.za and essentially find that particular property.
Yeah. The other reality is that it's such a short time period after conclusion of the transaction that, if someone dies within a few days of entering into the agreement, the parties generally walk away from it. They're not invested in it yet. And if it's subject to a mortgage bond, well, people who aren't alive can't apply for mortgage bonds, so that the transaction is going to fall away as a result of that anyway.
We've got another question here coming from Facebook. It's from Happiness Lala, who asks, when they withdraw the bond, does that mean I can get the money back or half?
No.
So this would be in the event where, when we were talking earlier, that the bond can be withdrawn, or if you go to the bank to say withdraw the bond because for some other reason you no longer want to continue with the transaction. So she wants to find out, does that mean that the seller that would be would get the money in full, or they would get it in half?
No, remember that when it comes to the registration of mortgage bond, money only flows on registration or transfer. So you register to transfer the property and you register the bond at the same time. And that's the only time that there's money flowing from a bond. Prior to that period, well, there's no money. So if the bond is withdrawn, that's it. I mean, the very first question you had was around. It made me think of the concept that what's so important in every transaction is to dot the I's and cross the T's. So the first thing that we do when a transaction starts to look rocky, when someone dies in a transaction, we say, were the suspensive conditions fulfilled properly? Was the bond granted in time for the right amount of money? Was there a trust? Was there trust resolution? Did all the trustees sign? Because we always find a way out of this transaction, because we don't want the liabilities that arise from it. And that's why I think it's important for conveyancers and for agents and for buyers and sellers, pay attention to the terms of your agreement. Make sure your agreement is properly binding, so that when there's a problem, people can't just walk away just because they want to walk away.
And you know what, Marius, I actually love that you highlight that, because when it comes to matters of the offer to purchase, so often, certainly as I'll say consumers, I'll speak a little bit here as, let's say, as a buyer, so often you just want to sign, you just want to initial and then sign at the end and not have a thorough read. Oftentimes you'll find that a lot of the offer to purchase agreements, you'll get them from an estate agent who'll tell you, oh, it's pretty standard. They would have filled in some of the stuff, or they'll just say sign and, initial and sign, they'll fill in the rest. That even you yourself as the consumer, or perhaps even on the other end as the seller, don't have full grasp of what the terms and conditions of the agreement are, and have fully internalized what you've effectively entered into. Because it is one of those things that I think so many people sign, but they don't have the full understanding that you've just entered into a legally binding, agreement, and here are the terms and conditions of that legally binding agreement, and these are the things that you are supposed to be doing, and these are the things the other party will do, and this is what you're liable for in the event where X and Y happen. I think so many of us probably don't quite understand, I'll say, the gravitas of signing an OTP, that you just kind of think, it's just a signature, if I don't get the full bond amount. So for example, even one of the suspensive clauses, they'll just say, securing bond finance, as opposed to stipulating that you want it at 100%, for example. So if the bank gives you 80%, one would argue, well, you actually have to raise that other 20% because bank finance has already been secured. So these are often, I think this is probably one of those very contentious issues as a consumer that we tend to struggle with so much in terms of understanding our OTP.
I'm astounded every day by what people sign without reading it.
Yeah.
They don't understand. They don't think about it. A silly example is this obligation to deliver building plans. Yes, I've got building plans, but there's an assumption the council's got your building plans. It's people sign things, but they don't actually think about what they're signing. It's they're just not careful enough.
Yeah. And you know what? I think before we wrap up, Marius, one of the things I'll certainly urge our viewers at home when it comes to an offer to purchase is read every line. If there's something you don't understand, ask your conveyancer. I found conveyancers actually are always readily available to answer your questions. Marius, I've shared with viewers at home how when I bought property for the first time, I bought 2 properties in a go, and at the time I was unaware that each property was going to have 2 different attorneys handling the matter because it was going to be bank financed. And by the time I got the 3rd and the 4th invoice from attorneys, I thought somebody's scamming me. They got my email address from somewhere. Who are these people sending me all these emails? And luckily, one of the conveyancers actually, explained it very well, and even explained, what the transferring attorney is going to be doing, what they as the bond registration attorneys are going to be doing. And so because it's 2 properties, they're basically going to be 4, firms handling the matter, and this is what they'll be doing along the way. So I do urge you at home to definitely ask questions, and they really will explain what it is that you're about to sign up for.
Absolutely, and I agree with you 100%. I take calls every day from people that I don't know, just answering their questions, and I'm always happy to sit in a boardroom with a buyer or a seller and say, okay, please explain this to me. I'd rather explain it to people. I don't even charge for it. I do it from a goodwill point of view. Let me explain to you what you're signing. Let me explain the process, because it makes my life easier too. If you know what to expect, if you know what's going to happen going forward, you know what's expected of you, I know what's expected of me, it actually makes life so much easier.
So Marius, before I let you go this evening, any final tip for viewers at home in the event where they somehow find themselves in the middle of a transaction and one party is either incapacitated or unfortunately passes away? I know you said it's not one of those things that happens very often, but in the unfortunate event where somebody at home does find themselves in that situation, any final tip for them?
Yeah, I think what you need to do is you need to properly understand the situation that you're in. So what I would do is I would call the conveyancer of the firm that you're dealing with and ask for a meeting to discuss exactly where it is. Because otherwise you sit, you're not sure, you hear from people at the BRI or people tell you what to do. Go to the person controlling the transaction and get direct advice as to what's going to happen from there, and just try and take practical decisions.
That's fantastic. And that's a great place to leave it. And that is Marius van Rensburg. Now, we're going to go for a quick break. And when we come back, we will be announcing the lucky winner of that 500 Rand cash prize. Remember to stay on the live, because you do need to message us down here below in order to claim that prize. Marius, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It's a pleasure as always. Nice to see you.
Welcome back to episode 203 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Khumalo. I was actually just saying to Marius right now that it's always so great speaking to lawyers who know how to break down an issue as though they're speaking to normal people who are not attorneys and really make the law as accessible as possible, because I know this is one of those issues that can easily be very verbose and big words that kind of lead us astray slightly. So it's always just so great to have various experts who know what they're talking about well, and we do that very well here in the Private Property Podcast. And of course, we deliver it in a very accessible way because we want to all understand so that we don't end up signing things that we're not clued up about. Well, this is the fun time of the show. Of course, you get to give away 500 Rand in cash to one lucky viewer at home. You have to be watching us live. And the only thing that you essentially have to do is to message us down here below if I call your name. And the potential winner of that 500 Rand spot prize goes to Durrell Jafta. Durrell Jafta, we are going to give you a minute. Just text us down here below. I'll also wait for the team to let me know if you are online and watching us live. And you can rather walk away with that 500 Rand in cash. That is Durrell Jafta. And this is, of course, for our Sherlock Holmes competition, where we have decided to spice things up a bit and every Wednesdays and Thursdays give away that spot prize, which is the 500 Rand in cash. And the only thing you have to do to walk away with that cash prize is to be watching us live. Wait until the end of the show in order to raise your hand and message us if we call your name. And so, Durrell Jafta, we are going to give you a little bit to see if you're live and watching us on air. I'm going to wait for my colleague to let me know if it's a yay or nay. And of course, in the meantime, you can enter that Sherlock Holmes competition that we are running across our social media platforms. All you have to do is to go to www.privateproperty.co.za and crack the riddle. We're in the 5th week. We're going to be running this great competition for the next 12 weeks. And I think this week's clue is one that's fairly easy, especially for those of you who are in Gauteng and I think in Centurion. I saw a couple of you commenting that you think you already know exactly where it is, and you have in fact cracked the code. And all you really have to do is to follow the prompts. Let us know where where you think the riddle leads you, and you can stand a chance of walking away with 5,000 Rand voucher every single Friday. So do enter. You can enter as many times as you would like. There's certainly there's no stopping you for entering more than once. We certainly do love seeing you enter multiple times. And I see that Durrell Jafta, unfortunately, is not watching us live. I'm going to go to the second potential winner of the 500 Rand cash prize giveaway. And the second potential winner is Farhana Siddiqui. That is Farhana Siddiqui. You are potentially the winner of that 500 Rand cash prize. Farhana Siddiqui on Facebook. You can message us, or even if you're watching us on YouTube, message us down here below. We want to see if you're watching us live, and if you are, then you get to walk away with that 500 Rand in cash. I'm going to give you a quick minute to just get back to us. And if Farhana is not, if she doesn't, or if they don't get in touch with us, I'll probably just let it roll over tomorrow evening, or perhaps rather to next week, because we only do this every Wednesday and Thursday, because on Friday we of course give away that 5,000 Rand voucher to one lucky winner. And I see that Farhana Siddiqui is in the house, so congratulations to Farhana Siddiqui. My colleague has let me know that you are in fact watching us, and there she is saying I'm here. So congratulations, Farhana, you walk away with that 500 Rand cash prize. And it's that easy to win here on Private Property and on the Private Property Podcast. Just watch us live, enter the competition, and make sure that you are watching until the very end. So if we call your name, you can let us know and you get to walk away with that cash prize. Well, that's it from me, Zamantungwa, and the rest of the Private Property Podcast team. This evening, I do not leave you alone. I leave you in the capable hands of Umbali Nwogo with the Farming Podcast at 8 p.m.
Hi, I'm Clinton Banfield. Our family and I live in Cape Town on the western seaboard. To be able to wake up and take in the scenery every day is an absolute pleasure. We probably have the best views of Table Mountain. There's some really amazing suburbs in our neighborhood. There's Milnerton, which is a central hub close to the city. There's some beautiful homes situated along the canal, which give you a breathtaking view of Table Mountain. A little bit further along the canal, you'll find Milnerton Golf Club, which is a great place to unwind with your mates. Then we have Blouberg, which is world-renowned for its beaches, where you'll often see kite surfers taking full advantage of the wind. To top it off, there's a great variety of family restaurants in the area, like Blue Peter, where people love to meet. The Bayside Mall is a landmark in Tableview, giving you an all-round retail experience in a relaxed and convenient environment. As a family, we've chosen to live in Atlantic Beach Golf Estate in Melkbosstrand. Our suburb is so chilled, it really gives you this constant holiday feel. We've lived here for 2 years and we've really enjoyed the laid-back lifestyle, and this is our neighborhood.